And watching them just reminded me so much of my own memories, having birthday parties and our home movies, and that shot of like somebody blowing out the candles on the cake and then opening the presents. I thought this moment was so sweet. The little baby that does not want to be held is so rambunctious. And that little girl making the faces. Now, the other pieces in the exhibition are all weavings. All right, so here is the wall of weavings in the exhibition. And then this is just a diagram explaining how warp threads go up and down and weft threads go weave back and forth in between the warp threads. And then here's my loom. And the loom has these frames that have a series of wires in them called heddles that have a little hole in the center that the thread runs through. And that's how you control which ones go up and down. And so here you can see some of the threads are lifted because one frame and all the heddles on that frame are lifting those threads. And then here you can see a view on the left with everything kind of unlifted. And on the right, one of the frames has lifted some of the heddles. So you can see it makes this opening through which you can put another yarn. And so this is a view when you're looking at the loom. And then when you raise up one of those frames or shafts, you can see some of those threads raise up. And then if you pass a piece of yarn through there and then press it down, you beat it down into place, then it makes another row, the weaving. And you can see that, like, if you look closely, these weavings are they're kind of interlocked. You can see how one thread will go over and under threads in a sequence to make this weaving. And this is represented in weaving diagrams by, we can see on the left, that's sort of the visualization of the threads being woven over and under each other. And on the right, that's how it would be drawn in a weaving. They call it a drawdown. And it basically looks like a grid that has some squares darkened and some of them not. And so like the darkened squares in this case represent the warp threads, and the light squares are the weft threads going over and under. So it's kind of, it basically looks like a bit mapped computer drawing. And weaving is very similar to computing in that one of the ways in which it's very similar to computing is that everything is either a warp thread on top or a weft thread on top, which is sort of equivalent to having a 1 or a 0 in computing. It's a very binary kind of medium. And then this is a book that shows what you can do with different kinds of weaving patterns. So at the top, that kind of horizontal diagram with some blue squares darkened in it, that's a draft pattern, or I'm sorry, the weavers are all going to correct me here probably, but so weaving draft. So this is how you thread your loom. This is how you put all the warp threads into the heddles in a certain order so that you can make different kinds of patterns based on that initial threading. So down below you can see if you weave in a certain way, then you'll get all these different patterns that are shown on the page. So the draft is sort of like equivalent to the program that you would run if you were programming a computer. So the draft pattern is like the computer program. So anyway, I'm going to talk about Ada Lovelace for a little bit, and then you'll see how this kind of connects back to weaving. So Ada Lovelace was a 19th century, she's born in the 1800s, Her father was the poet, the English poet, Lord Byron. And her mother separated from Byron when she was very young because he was sort of a crazy rock star poet guy. And her mother was really worried that he was going to be a bad influence on her growing up. So she separated from him. She had Ada thoroughly educated in math and science because she thought poetry was going to be really evil and like turn her to the dark side. So she was really good at math and science, and she was a total whiz at it and excelled. And later on, when she got older, she went to a salon and met this man, Charles Babbage, who was an inventor, and he had invented this amazing thing called the difference engine, which was basically a very early kind of steampunk calculator. And it could calculate all kinds of things, and it just used like hand cranks and really very it was not a digital, well, let's see, what's the word I'm looking for. It was not an electronic computer, but it was a manually operated kind of calculator. And this completely blew her away, and they became friends and collaborators. And later on, he came up with the idea for this bigger, better machine that he called the analytical engine. And this was actually the design for the first computer. So it could do all the things that a modern computer does, like it could do algebraic equations, it could hold things in memory, it could even print out results of calculations. It was pretty amazing, but he actually never got the funds to build it. So all it was a series of drawings and diagrams and plans. But Ada actually was, she translated a description of the analytical engine that was written by an Italian mathematician into English as just a favor for Mr. Babbage. And in it, she added her own notes. And in her notes, she wrote a description of how to do calculations in using this difference engine. And that description is actually the very first computer program. So she is the first computer programmer. All right. I hope you're all still with me. I know this is a lot to throw at you, but it's coming it's going to arc around. So the Jacquard Loom was a loom that created these very intricate woven patterns like damask and brocade. So like here are two examples. They basically look like paintings, but they're woven out of thread, just very, very fine thread in these extremely complex patterns. And they were woven using these looms called draw looms that usually took at least 2 people to operate. So there would be one person sitting in front of the loom lifting or throwing a shuttle back and forth that had the weft threads in it, and then a second person who would go behind the loom and pick up all the individual threads that you needed to pick up for that single row to make these complicated patterns. And it was so complex that after a whole day of work, these 2 people on one draw loom could only weave, I think, like 1 inch. Until Joseph Marie Jacquard came along, and he invented a way to make this much, much faster. So this is a portrait of Jacquard that is actually woven on one of his inventions, the Jacquard Loom. So it's an attachment that sits on top of a draw loom, and you can see it at the top of this image. And what it does is through a series of, you can see here, there's a chain of punch cards, and this punch card fits against a mechanism with pins that, depending on if there's a hole or not in the punch card right next to that pin, it will let the pin either raise up or stay in place. And then a corresponding work thread will either raise up or stay in place. And that way it automated the lifting of these threads. And this got the draw boys very angry, and they started rushing in and breaking looms and breaking Jacquard looms in protest. And that's actually where the term Luddite comes from. So these draw boys banded together and called themselves Luddites and broke looms. So, you know, we think of Luddites now as people who prefer to write letters rather than send emails, but they're actually people who protested against the technology of the draw loom. So this is a close-up of that photo or that image of Joseph Jacquard that was woven using one of his Jacquard looms. So the punch cards that ran the draw looms are actually what inspired the punch cards that ran computers. So Charles Babbage saw those punch cards and thought that would be the perfect input method for the difference or the analytical engine. And so that's actually what he used. And later on, other people who invented calculating devices and things that led to the first electronic computers also used punch cards because they were just this ideal input mechanism. So on the top is a punch card from, I think it was one of the very first punch cards used for the US Census in the late 1800s. And on the bottom, there's a more contemporary punch card. It's an IBM punch card from maybe the 60s or 70s. And I want to show you very quickly a video. So I think, okay. All right, Christina, can you still see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. All right. This is a video that shows you that Jacquard mechanism.
This is a mechanical Jacquard loom. This technology was developed in France in 1803 by a weaver named Joseph Marie Jacquard. The key thing about this loom is that it controls every warp thread, the threads that go from the front to the back of the loom, individually. Because it can do that, the loom can create very complex, fancy patterns in the cloth more quickly and with greater accuracy than the technology available before this loom was developed. These cards are what carry the instructions that are read by the apparatus on the second floor that tells the loom what pattern to create. The holes in the cards are read by a series of pins up in the apparatus, and those holes tell the apparatus which threads down here should be raised for each pass of my shuttle across the warp. Some of you might recognize these cards as looking similar to computer punch cards. Back in the early days of computer technology, punch cards carried instructions that told the early computers what kind of calculations to do. So this loom is the great-great-great-grandfather of the computer technology that we all use today. And that technology started with a machine that produces cloth. Oops.
So that's the connection, one of the connections between weaving and computing through the punch card. So I created this piece, Ada, which is on display at the USC Pacific Asian Museum now as part of We Are Here. And it is actually a representation of two punch cards, but woven punch cards. And here's a closer view of it. So in Ada, I actually encoded a secret message. Ada Lovelace, in her notes about the different or analytical engine, wrote this very apt observation. She said, "We may say most aptly that the analytical engine weaves algebraic patterns just as the Jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves." And so I actually wove that message into those two punch cards. So this was my setup. You can see on the left when I was weaving this, that's an in progress photo. And then on the top right, that's my cheat sheet that I used to follow as I was weaving that. And the bottom right, that's a punch card that shows, it's like a key that shows you what the punch code is for every number and letter and other non-alphabetic characters. So one thing I was trying to do when I was weaving this, I was trying to make it very neat and precise because I was trying to make something that referenced technology and was supposed to be something that ran a computer. But so I was trying to make those little black bumps that corresponded to the holes in the punch card, like the same size and keeping them even. And it was like an exercise in, well, it's just like a failed exercise. And I realized that there are certain things that computers do well, and there are certain things that humans do well. And your computers are very good at doing the same thing over and over again, exactly the same way every time. They're very consistent, but people are not. But that's what is so prized about things like hand weaving, because they are not consistent. They are subtle differences. Every time you pass a shuttle and you beat the thread into place, it looks a little different than the last time you did it. And each little bump that I made that was supposed to correspond to a hole, it looks different from every other one, you know, even though there are like 200 of them or whatever in this piece. And that's what people enjoy about things that are hand woven, or, you know, things that are maybe letterpress printed, or a handwritten note, like somebody's actual handwriting versus an email. It's those human imperfections that actually make these things so enjoyable, that tactility that they have, that computers and electronic things don't. So I'll talk about a different piece now. A couple years ago, I heard on the radio this author, Natalia Holt, talking about her book, Rise of the Rocket Girls, which is about, well, it says the women who propelled us from missiles to the moon to Mars. So it was about the human computers at JPL. And I had never realized before or heard before that people were called computers before there are these machines called computers, and that those people at that time were almost always women. I had never heard that. And of course, now there's Hidden Figures, which has told that story so well about the African-American human computers who worked at NASA. And I started delving deeper into this history, and I learned that the women, or the people who ran the very first computers like ENIAC, those teams were almost always women. So the people who designed them are often men. They designed the hardware, but operating them was almost always women's work. And women went into computer programming in the 40s into the 50s, even the 60s at this very high rate. It was this kind of convergence of different factors in society at the time. So women who had gone to college and graduated with degrees in math or science would look for jobs. And at that time, businesses started buying computers because that was supposed to be like the next tool that was going to give them this competitive advantage. And they needed people to operate them. And no one had had a computer in the office before. No one had any preconceived ideas of who should be a computer programmer. And here are all these women graduating with degrees in math and science. And so it was kind of like this happy marriage of these women needing jobs, this job that needed to be filled. And so there are a lot of women who ended up being computer programmers. And then the role started being associated with women. It sort of became thought that if you were going to hire a computer programmer, the ideal person to hire would be a woman. So much so that these are two recruitment brochures from IBM in the late 50s or early 60s. And one of them is even called My Fair Ladies. But all that changed. So you can see around 1985, just before 1985, actually it was 1984, the number of computer science degrees or actually in this case, the number of women majoring in computer science went down. Like all these kind of high-powered fields like law, medicine, the sciences in general, the number of women in those fields kept going up steadily over time. But then for computer science, it just took a nosedive. And there are a few theories of why this happened. And my piece, Disrupting the Industry, shows it's a representation of that rise and fall of the percentage of women getting computer science degrees over time. So it begins in, I think, 1962 or so, or no, I have it written down here. I need to cheat and look at my notes. It's like 1962 to 2008, 1966 to 2010. That's what it is. And so the peak at 1984 is marked by that band of copper in the center. There's a detail. So in 1984, a couple of things happened. The Apple Macintosh was released, which was one of the first personal computers that really popularized the idea of computing as a hobby or a fun thing or an educational thing to be done at home. The movie War Games had been out for about a year. Other movies like Weird Science and Revenge of the Nerds also came out around that time. And what seemed to be happening is that those things popularized this idea that a computer was something that a boy played, like a nerdy teenage boy played with in his bedroom. And often those computers, those first personal computers that people bought, were being bought for young boys as kind of educational toys. And then their fathers would, play around on the computer with them and kind of do that as like an educational hobby, more so than they would do with the girls. In fact, I have a friend who said that her brother got the personal computer, her brother got the Macintosh, and she really, really wanted to play with it, but she didn't get one. And so slowly, this perception of who was supposed to be a computer programmer changed from being a woman to being a man. And so much so that now we have, like, Silicon Valley very dominated by men. And it's also interesting that these values of what a computer programmer, or this idea of what a computer programmer should be like and how they should behave, has changed too. Because originally, when women were recruited to be computer programmers, they were sought after because they thought that computer programmers should be diligent. They should have, like, maybe enjoy things like knitting or cooking a recipe, or cooking from a recipe. But those qualities which are associated with women and then associated with computer programmers changed so much that now very different qualities are sought after. Like, first of all, being a young guy, and maybe bad hygiene or antisocial tendencies. And what happened is that the qualities associated with computer programming just kind of came from whoever happened to be in that role at that time. And so it's been a complete 180 from what a computer programmer was thought of before. So then I'll talk about a couple more of my weavings. I know we're coming up to, I think we have like 15 minutes left or so, so I'll try to go through these a little quicker so we have more time for Q&A and discussion afterwards. So I did this pair of weavings, noise, signal, and noise. This one is noise. And I was thinking about the second law of thermodynamics, which deals with this idea of signal to noise ratio, how in any kind of communication, like electronic communication, you're looking for a higher ratio of signal or the pattern to the background noise in order to be able to discern the meaning in the communication. And so in this piece, noise, there is a pattern of the weaving that is kind of being disrupted by this background chatter that's happening because of the yarn that I'm using has a lot of kind of color and noise and pattern happening in it. And so it's pushing and pulling against the signal. So it's becoming, your eye kind of has to work harder to discern the pattern or the signal above the noise. And then in Signal, which is something of a excuse me, I can't speak today. But Signal, which is sort of a partner to this one, is looking at how computer chips are designed to have components in a certain arrangement to speed up the communication. And the design of them is based on what is going to make these components talk to each other faster, make the whole thing run more efficiently. And so the visual design is not really considered for it, but it does make sort of an interesting visual pattern. And similarly, weavings were, I think my daughter is walking in and she's, I told her to stay away for a bit, but yeah, come on, my artist talking, working from home. So in weavings, back in the Bauhaus, which was someplace where women were allowed to enroll, but they were all shunted into the weaving program. So all these women enrolled in the Bauhaus because they're excited about this idea of, you know, art and architecture and design and having these new opportunities to learn alongside men. And then once they got there, they discovered that they're all going to be relegated to the weaving department because that's where the leader of the Bauhaus thought that women belonged. They struggled to turn weaving into an activity that was as sort of rigorous and design-oriented as all of the other disciplines of the Bauhaus. And so they were trying very hard to turn weaving from an activity that was seen as making pictures with yarn into something where they were like architects creating, designing things that had very, needed to have certain qualities in order to perform well in industrial conditions. Like Annie Albers would design different kinds of textiles to perform as like wall coverings or as room dividers, and she had to take all these constraints into consideration to design these things. And so this so Signal is kind of looking at how the design and the visual qualities of things can sometimes interplay with each other. And then the last piece I'm going to talk about is Timesheet. So for several weeks, a couple years ago, I started writing down what I was doing every day from like the moment I woke up till I went to sleep. And I categorized everything into all these different categories, like sleep and personal care, food, housework, childcare. And I just wanted to see what kinds of patterns emerged. And when I was artist in residence at the Women's Center for Creative Work last fall, 2019, I started weaving these into a series of weavings. So I would weave one weaving that would represent one day in a week of that time. And the result was this piece called Timesheet. So you can see I have a different yarn that I selected to represent each of these different categories of how I spent my time. So like sleep is this one yarn, and then food is a different yarn, and then childcare is a different kind of yarn. And I started at the top of the weaving was 6 a.m. and then it went chronologically through the day and ended at midnight. And then here's the whole series that is in the USC Pacific Asia Museum right now. And so it's 1 week, it's November 4th through 10th of 2018. It starts on Sunday, November 4th, and then you have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And then here's the detail. So I wanted to weave this while I was at the Women's Center during these open studio hours where people could drop in and see me weaving, because not many people get a chance to see how fabric is made. I mean, we interact with fabric daily. We wear fabric on our bodies. We sleep with fabric over us. We walk on fabric. We cover our windows with fabric. But it's something that's kind of mysterious. The making of it is about as mysterious as like the making of our iPhone. You wouldn't know what was inside your iPhone. But it's this analogous kind of piece of technology that we don't think of as technology. And when I was keeping track of my time and then weaving all these things into these timesheets, I noticed a couple of things. One of them is that I spend a lot of time dealing with food, like a lot more time than I ever thought before. And also I found it really stressful when I was keeping track of my time. I felt like I had to be especially accountable because I was going to be writing down how many hours or how many minutes I was spending in each different kind of activity. It was like I had this sort of invisible taskmaster trying to make sure I was efficient and I wasn't wasting my time and I wasn't doing anything that I wasn't supposed to be doing, which is silly because it was just me. I was accountable to myself and I was just tracking my time on this piece of paper. But it kind of speaks to how there's like industrial time and then there's sort of human time. And like industrial time came from factories where people would have to clock in at a certain hour and make a whole bunch of widgets and be measured by how many widgets they could produce in their time in the factory, and then clock out at a certain time and then go home and then not be working. And so now when I was tracking my time at home doing non-industrial things, I still was carrying over these sort of industrialized attitudes towards my time. Like, okay, I'm clocking in, now I'm doing cooking and I have to, cook for this amount of time. Or now I'm supposed to be working, or now I'm supposed to be working on my art practice and I need to just do that and be productive. And I also found that there's so many times when I think as humans, you kind of naturally multitask. Like especially if you're a parent, and I'm sure any of you with children right now is feeling this especially keenly. You're trying to do your job while you're also watching your kid. You're trying to make a meal while you're trying to also make sure your kid is doing their worksheets from their take-home schoolwork, or you're doing all these different things at the same time. And that's sort of an additional way that we're dealing with time differently now that we have this sort of industrialized view of time, but then we're kind of taken out of this industrial context. And one other thing I was trying to do with this series is look at all these kinds of labor that people do, like cooking and cleaning, taking care of children, these sort of caring activities that are not remunerated by society. Like you don't get a paycheck for raising your child, or you don't get paid for unloading the groceries and putting them away. But still, all these things need to be done in order for people to live and thrive, and then maybe go out into the broader world and earn a paycheck or a wage to then take home. And these two different kinds of labor, and one of these kinds of labor is very often not counted. And art practice kind of falls into that too, because no one's paying an artist a paycheck, at least not to my knowledge, to produce artwork, but artists still produce artwork, and they do have this kind of caring sort of value to society. They're things that uplift us, that give meaning to our lives, that reflect our inner thoughts or hopes, and make them visible and give society like some object or experience to sort of rally around. And so by creating these timesheets, I wanted to create a physical object that could kind of be a record of that kind of time, that kind of labor that was expended. And then because I'm calling them artworks, they then have this value to them that's put on them as artworks. They become works that have this aesthetic and cultural value. So that is what I will leave you with right now. So thank you for listening to me. I know that was a lot of talking for 45 minutes, and I am not used to talking uninterrupted like that, so I hope I didn't blather on too much. And I would love if you have some questions or comments, and if we could get a kind of conversation started.